If you thought DICE was setting out to tell lesser-known stories about World War II in Battlefield 5, it turns out that they've set out to revise lesser-known stories in order to fit a modern socio-political agenda.
Regarde Idrissa. Nous sommes des rois.
The worst offender by far in the campaign is the mission about a Norwegian mother and daughter who destroy Germany's ability to produce heavy water, an essential component in the German efforts to develop an atomic bomb. The mother is captured by the Germans after a team of British commandos is killed in their attempt to destroy the facility themselves. The daughter then skis into the area and rescues her mother. Then, together, they sabotage the facility themselves. Upon their escape, though, they are cornered on a bridge by the Germans. Knowing that there is still a shipment of heavy water on its way to Germany, the mother implores her daughter to take a set of documents to a rendezvous point, where I assume British or Allied intelligence agents are waiting. I don't really know because the game never indicated. In any event, the mother throws her daughter off the bridge. The daughter then battles her way through more German troops, falls off a cliff into freezing water, and begins to lose consciousness from hypothermia. Somehow she makes it to a cabin in the woods, where a German soldier is waiting. She physically overpowers him, strangles him, and then passes out from exhaustion. She wakes up and reads her mother's notes and decides to undertake the mission to destroy the heavy water shipments on her own, since there was no one there at the rendezvous point. The daughter succeeds in destroying most of the shipments, and then her mother sacrifices herself in order to sink a German submarine carrying the very last shipment of heavy water. The problem with this scenario is that it's a blatant lie. It's obviously based on the Allies' plan to cripple the Norwegian Vemork plant in 1943, which was being used by Germany to produce heavy water. But DICE's version of events completely writes the real-life Norwegian commandos out of their own story. The crippling of the Vemork plant was orchestrated by the Combined Operations Headquarters starting in October 1942. The plan originally consisted of two parts. The first, Operation Grouse, would drop a group of Norwegian commandos into the area as an advance force. Later on, a team of British engineers would land in the area via military gliders to attack the plant itself. This was Operation Freshman. On October 19, 1942, a four-man team of Norwegian commandos parachuted into the region. They skied over a considerable distance to the Vemork plant, where their job was to memorize the layout and gather intelligence. On November 19, 1942, Operation Freshman commenced. Two airspeed Horsa gliders, towed by Handley Page Halifax bombers, each carrying two pilots and 15 Royal Engineers of the 9th Field Company, 1st British Airborne Division, took off from England and headed off to Norway. Now, the towing of gliders had always been hazardous, but in this case it was made worse by the long flying distance to Norway and poor weather conditions, which severely restricted visibility. One of the Halifax tugs crashed into a mountain, killing all 7 aboard. Its glider was able to cast off, but crashed nearby, resulting in several more casualties. The other Halifax eventually arrived at the vicinity of the landing zone. Although the weather conditions had substantially improved by then, it was still impossible to locate the exact landing zone, owing to the failure of the link between the ground and aircraft beacons. With fuel running low, the pilot decided to abort the operation and return to base. Shortly afterwards, however, they encountered heavy turbulence, and the tow line snapped. The glider made a crash landing, not far from where the other glider had crashed. Sadly, the Norwegians were unable to reach the crash sites in time, and the survivors eventually came into the hands of the Gestapo and were all executed under Adolf Hitler's commando order. This part DICE got right. German soldiers were under orders to kill any British commandos they captured, even if they surrendered. And yes, this violated the terms of the Third Geneva Convention regarding treatment of prisoners of war. With the Germans now on alert, the surviving Norwegian commandos decided to hide out in the mountains and await further instructions from the Allies. They survived on moss and lichen during the winter until just before Christmas they were finally able to kill a reindeer. Since British authorities were aware that these commandos were still alive, they decided to mount another operation with them. On the night of February 16, 1943, Operation Gunnerside began with an additional 6 Norwegian commandos dropped in by parachute. They landed successfully and rendezvoused with the other Norwegians. The combined team then made final preparations for their assault on the plant, which was to take place on the night of February 27th or 28th, 1943. Following the failed attempt of Operation Freshman, the Germans had placed mines, floodlights, and additional guards around the plant. While the mines and lights remained in place, security of the actual plant itself had slackened somewhat over the winter months. However, the single 246-foot bridge spanning the deep ravine, 660 feet above the river Mana, was fully guarded. Thus, the force elected to descend into the ravine, ford the icy river, and climb the steep hill on the far side. Fortunately, the Allies had a Norwegian agent within the plant who supplied detailed plans and schedule information. The commandos used this information to enter the main basement by a cable tunnel and through a window. Inside the plant, the only person they came across was a Norwegian caretaker, who turned out to be very willing to cooperate with them. The team then planted explosive charges on the heavy water electrolysis chambers, and attached a fuse allowing sufficient time for their escape. The charges detonated, the electrolysis chambers were destroyed, and the commandos escaped, all without firing a shot or harming anyone. Now, remember that submarine that the mother had sacrificed herself in order to destroy the last shipment of heavy water? My guess is that its real-life counterpart was the SF Hydro, a Norwegian steam-powered railway ferry that operated on Lake Tinn in Telemark. Its primary purpose was to transport raw materials and fertilizer from the Norsk hydro plant across the lake to the port in Skien. The plant had begun to produce heavy water also, but the production area was located under 7 stories of reinforced concrete, so bombing it was out of the question. Eventually, the Germans canceled production there though, and decided to move the remaining heavy water supply to Germany. The resistance found out about this and moved to sink the SF Hydro, which was to carry the very last shipment of heavy water across Lake Tinn. And on February 20th, 1944, the SF Hydro was successfully sunk. But again, in this instance, we know it was a group of Norwegian men who sank it. The story is quite sad actually, because they went out of their way to minimize civilian casualties, and despite their best efforts, 14 Norwegian civilians were killed. I'm honestly a bit taken back by how brazenly DICE rewrote all of this. As far as I know, Operation Grouse, Freshman, and Gunnerside are common knowledge in Norway. The other campaign missions are arguably just as scandalous. Under No Flag asserts that the British Special Boat Service was made up of criminals and cutthroats. Now, I didn't know anything about the SBS prior to having played Battlefield 5, so it's a good thing I decided to do a little research. The real Special Boat Service was founded in July of 1940 by a commando officer, Roger Courtney. Courtney became a commando recruit in 1940 and was sent to the Combined Training Center in Scotland. After he couldn't sell his commander there on the idea of a folding kayak brigade, he got a kayak and used it to infiltrate a military ship anchored nearby in the harbor. He climbed aboard undetected, wrote his initials on the door to the captain's cabin, and stole a deck gun cover. He was then promoted to captain and given command of 12 men, the very first Special Boat Service unit. Now, if you read about the SBS recruitment process, they were almost entirely comprised of volunteers from the Royal Marines, not prisons. Why DICE would write the Royal Marines out of their own history is a mystery.
Because you're Billy Bridger. You are the son of big, bad, horrible Arthur Bridger. I'm Arthur fucking Bridger. Give me the fucking money.
DICE's other mission, Tigre, is by far the most accurate of all the stories they tell. You play as a colonial African soldier fighting to retake southern France during Operation Dragoon in 1944. These African colonial troops were known as Tigre Sénégalais, which basically means Senegalese skirmisher. Now, the nomenclature Senegalese is a little misleading though, because not all of them were actually from Senegal. They came from all over West and Central Africa, but Senegal was where the 1st Regiment was formed in 1857 by the French colonial powers, so the name stuck. During World War II, the Tirailleurs Sénégalais fought in Libya, on the island of Elba, the Battle of France in 1940, and they also took part in Operation Dragoon in 1944. DICE's depiction of them, however, seems to play fast and loose with history, once again in order to further an agenda. For example, upon arriving in France for the very first time, Deme, the protagonist, says this.
On disait, nous sommes français. Nous sommes français. Mais une fois en France, nous avons vu à quel point nous étions français.
This feels like an appeal to modern-day Third World immigration politics. Given the recent behavior of French President Macron and his fervent rejection of nationalism, I have little doubt that a scene like this will pull on the heartstrings of many French NPCs.
What is your plan?
My plan?
Yes.
I haven't planned yet, but I wish.
The game continues to virtue signal by showing that the tirailleurs weren't allowed to fight at first, and attempts to victimize them by making them do logistical work.
On va faire ça jusqu'à quand?
Jusqu'à ce qu'on ait fini.
C'est tout? C'est tout ce que l'on va faire?
Écoute, les choses ici sont différentes.
What's interesting about the statement "Les choses ici sont différentes" is that it sort of suggests that things were better back in Africa. But of course, that's not what DICE was trying to convey here. The scene plays on the popular, mostly American sentiment that not letting blacks fight in World War II was itself a form of oppression. The thing is, the French really didn't have any issues letting non-white colonial troops fight, and the French units in World War II were not segregated. Secondly, there were literally millions of white Europeans doing the same exact type of logistical work that we see these Africans doing here. Now, were they oppressed? Many will argue that tirailleurs were all involuntary conscripts. Now, putting aside that many of them did volunteer, how morally abhorrent is it to spare conscripts from frontline combat? This isn't to say that people under French colonial rule had no grievances, but if you were a second-class citizen drafted against your will, how upset would you be to get handed a shovel instead of a rifle? It's almost as if the leftist argument is that second-class citizens should be first-class cannon fodder. The virtue signaling gets worse though when Idrissa tells his friend Deme not to shoot a fleeing German soldier. The context is clearly meant to portray these African troops as being morally superior to Europeans. This is then followed up by a sequence wherein captured black troops are executed by Germans because their commander didn't want to see them anymore. Now, to be fair, there are documented accounts of some Germans randomly executing tirailleurs sénégalais after the Battle of France in 1940. For example, a group of 70 white Frenchmen in tirailleurs sénégalais were captured at Chasselet after they had attacked the Germans from a church. The men were racially segregated, and the blacks summarily executed by machine gun fire. The thing is, several white French officers were executed as well for trying to defend their black troops. Some were even executed and buried in mass graves for the simple fact of having commanded black troops. Yet not once did DICE make any mention of this, let alone depict a single white Frenchman commanding or fighting alongside these black troops. Now, I may be wrong, but I believe DICE's mission here is based off of the 6e Régiment de Tirailleurs Sénégalais, which helped liberate several German fortifications around Toulon in August of 1944. The thing is, these guys were part of a larger force of Moroccan artillery and French tank units, and yet via a series of in-game monologues, DICE tries to act as if the French just threw them to the wolves with no proper training, equipment, or support. Again, you never see any French units operating alongside them, or white officers commanding them, and the narrative seems almost specifically aimed at depicting black men as having succeeded where incompetent French men had failed. But let's get back to DICE's depiction of Germans executing black troops. As far as I know, that simply didn't happen to the tirailleurs at Toulon. The random German executions of blacks happened in 1940 during the Battle of France, and while it is deeply disturbing, I don't believe it is productive or fair to Germans that DICE portrays them all as having been so merciless. For example, we know that Germany took some 30,000 black African French troops prisoner and housed them until the end of the war. Jewish historian Raphael Scheck said in his book about French colonial prisoners that, quote, "In marked contrast to other racially stigmatized groups such as Jews and Gypsies, French colonial soldiers did not experience an escalation of brutality under the control of Nazi Germany. In fact, taken as a whole, the experiences of colonial POWs were neither better nor worse than those of white POWs," unquote. Now, it's true that many black POWs died in German captivity, but this was a fate shared by other Allied prisoners and was mostly due to disease and logistical problems at the end of the war, not systematic extermination. Most people don't know this, but the Germans had a few black troops themselves. Sure, there weren't many of them, and it's not like the Germans considered them their equals, but again, it wasn't official German policy to exterminate any and all brown people they came across. In fact, there are some interesting accounts of German POWs in Texas who found the treatment of African Americans there quite deplorable. To be clear though, I am not trying to discount any atrocities committed by the Germans. I'm simply asking that we view history with a sense of proportion, rather than continue down this endless, multi-generational German guilt trip. Moreover, the tirailleurs sénégalais may not have always been so well behaved themselves. According to some historians and various personal accounts, back in Africa, they had a tendency to forcibly take women as wives or captives after they defeated enemies in battle. These were known as prises de guerre, and the French officers apparently went along with it so as to maintain order and recruitment quotas. A French woman, Madame Paul Bontin, in the account of her journey from Senegal to Niger in 1894 said, quote, "On a dû tolérer officiellement cette infamie afin de pouvoir empêcher les abus, et aussi parce que, supprimer la perspective de gagner captifs, le noir ne s'enrôlerait plus. Pas d'argent, pas de Suisse, pas d'esclaves rasiés, pas de soldats nègres," unquote. DICE ends the mission by showing a sequence wherein all the black troops are erased from a photo. I think this plays on the semi-popular belief that France has ignored the contributions of its black colonial troops. Specifically, there is a lot of discussion about blacks not being photographed in Paris when it was liberated. Well, when was Paris liberated? August 25th, 1944. This is the same time many of the tirailleurs sénégalais were fighting in Toulon. Paris is located at the other end of the country, and thus there was really no way that they could have been in Paris and also fighting in Toulon at the same time. Furthermore, in August of 1944, during Operation Dragoon, black Africans made up about 10% of France's invasion force. Now, that's not saying that France should not be grateful to them. But if we look at the war with a sense of proportion, France probably owes more gratitude to the British and the Americans, who by July 24th of 1944 had suffered 120,000 casualties in the invasion of Normandy, which was what directly led to the liberation of Paris, not Operation Dragoon. That said, there was an internal memo sent from the American General Walter B. Smith to French command 5 months before the liberation of Paris, concerning which French division should lead the Allies into the city. Quote, "It is highly desirable that the French division should be composed of white personnel," which points to the 2nd Armored Division, which has only 1/4 native troops, and is the only French division which could be made 100% white, unquote. Now, this is likely where DICE got the idea to erase blacks from photos, and to an extent it's true, although the French and the Americans never doctored any photos. What happened is that Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division replaced all its African troops with Portuguese and Spanish volunteers before leaving Morocco for England. This was not a case of black troops fighting to liberate France and then being replaced right at the last minute before they got to march down the Champs-Élysées. What's more is that many French historians point out that Leclerc himself had no issues with black troops parading in France. The archives show that they often did so in other cities, and in fact, there were even black troops parading in French units in Paris during its liberation. They simply weren't in Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division. Now, was it wrong on the part of the Americans to dictate this to the French? Sure, but that doesn't give DICE the right to portray the French in Battlefield 5 as having written their black troops out of history. Also, I would again ask that people view this with some sense of proportion. Contrary to how DICE portrayed the situation, this was not a case of brown people doing all the work and then whites taking all the credit. The black troops in question here were replaced before the Normandy invasion, and the overwhelming majority of Allied combatants during Operation Overlord were white Europeans. Moreover, while some 17,000 tirailleurs sénégalais were killed or wounded in World War II, over 210,000 metropolitan French men died defending their country, and almost 400,000 others were wounded. The French didn't write the tirailleurs out of history. In fact, they've erected several monuments in honor of them. They've awarded them with various medals and commendations where applicable, and there's even a French historian, Julien Fagetas, who has dedicated much of his life to telling others of their deeds. When asked in the magazine RFI Afrique what he thought about the popular narrative that colonial troops have never been officially recognized by France, Fagetas said this, quote, "The issue of the Senegalese tirailleurs pensions is indeed a huge liability in Franco-African relations, but we often hear that France has never paid homage to these men, or that they were never allowed to parade with French veterans. These accusations do not hold up. The archives contain photos of them marching during commemorative ceremonies of both world wars. Finally, in 1957, the former tirailleurs were celebrated with dignity as part of the centennial ceremony of their unit. These historical facts will continue to be obscured until the issue of the pension has been settled." Unquote. And there you might have it. It would appear that accusations of racist revisionism began cropping up once the French government froze the tirailleurs pensions in 1959 as a result of African nations beginning to gain independence. The logic being that since there was to be no more empire, then France alone, being the leader of the empire but not the empire itself, should not be held responsible to fulfill obligations made by the empire. Now in this case, I'm not sure I agree with that, but it's not an entirely absurd notion. A lot of people also like to focus on the decision to replace some 15,000 tirailleurs sénégalais with metropolitan French men in autumn of 1944. The tirailleurs were then subsequently stationed at Toulon shortly before being discharged and repatriated to Africa. This is commonly referred to as le blanchiment des troupes coloniales. But I argue that this really wasn't anything to get upset about. In fact, why should the tirailleurs sénégalais have been subjected any further to a war that many would argue they should never have been asked to fight to begin with? Okay, so it's about time to wrap this one up. Now, I could wait for the final campaign mission of Battlefield 5 to come out on December 4th, but I've honestly spent way too much time on this as it is, and I've had to discard a lot of material in the interest of time and relevancy. Overall though, I think DICE has been deliberately disingenuous and self-serving. They have either twisted the facts or completely rewritten them in favor of furthering a modern social agenda. Taking a few liberties for the sake of gameplay or dramatization is one thing, but this was deliberate, inclusive revisionism and leftist propaganda. The more I read about World War II, the more I'm convinced that this has been one of the most heavily distorted and propagandized historical events. The thing is, if we don't examine history honestly and carefully, what do we really learn from it?